Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming today to listen to and participate in the panel discussion in connection with the exhibition, Growing Up in Civil Rights Richmond, on view in the Harnett Museum of Art. My name is Elizabeth Schlater, and I'm Deputy Director and Curator of Exhibitions. Can you hear me okay? Okay, Director of Exhibitions at the University of Richmond Museums. Today's event is one of several planned throughout the run of the show, which is on view until May 10th. Additional events are listed in our calendar, which is available for pickup in the gallery. These events include 2 upcoming gallery talks, which will feature some of the participants from the exhibition, as well as a docudrama performance in April that'll be inspired by the oral histories in the exhibition and performed by U of R students, Armstrong High School students, Armstrong High School alumni, and several of the participants in the exhibition. And it's originating out of a class being taught by U of R professors Laura Browder, who's one of our panelists, and she'll be leading that panel discussion, and by U of R professor Patricia Herrera, who is in the Department of Theater and Dance. Part of my job for kicking off today's discussion is to thank our sponsors, which include the university's Cultural Affairs Committee, the Lewis S. Booth Arts Fund, the local REB Foundation, and the Elizabeth Firestone Graham Foundation, which gave us funds to assist in producing the exhibition catalog, which acts as a fantastic supplement to the exhibition itself. That catalog is for sale in the gallery and features several essays, including an especially informative historical piece by public historian Elvatrice Belsches, who's also one of our panelists today. The most generous contributions to this entire project, however, came from the participants themselves, the people who shared their times, their stories, and their memories with us, which we can now read and experience in the exhibition. Richmond Times-Dispatch columnist Michael Paul Williams, who's also joining us today on the panel, contributed an essay to the catalog. He's also one of our participants. And I wondered if those of you in the audience who are also participants wouldn't mind just raising your hands. I know several of you are here. Fantastic, thank you. So when I was thinking about how to introduce today's event, I knew I wanted to acknowledge in the present moment the countless gracious and kind acts of sharing by all the participants that have occurred in the past years that this project has been in development. First of all, these participants, meaning the 30 people profiled in this exhibition, you shared your time. Many of you gave hours to be interviewed by oral historian and Professor Laura Browder, and that sometimes included more than one sitting, several phone calls, and emails to gather together the fullness of your thoughts, memories, and reflections. You shared your time with photographer Brian Palmer and exhibition curator Ashley Kistler, who are also on the panel, in photo shoots that took place in front of locations that were of importance. Several of you continue to share your time in attending events like the panel today and in bringing your friends, families, and groups that you belong to the exhibition. As an example, last Monday, participant Glennis Fleming brought her Girl Scout troop and created an educational activity to help the girls make connections between the stories and the images on the wall, and the names and the faces, more importantly. In February, Valerie Perkins will bring her Red Hat group to see the show, and later a group of with high school alumni. I cannot begin to describe how much it means to us in the museums that you're proud enough of this exhibition to share it with others who you care about. You, the participants, shared your faces. And as someone who actively tries to avoid being photographed, I admire this seemingly superficial act. I imagine it might not be easy to see your face blown up 40 to 50 inches wide on the walls of a gallery. However, you all look fantastic, and you were always in good hands with Brian and Ashley. Yeah. But it's also not necessarily easy for someone to see their face next to their words, as in the exhibition, with the large portraits right next to the text panels. These panels often have stories of upsetting or cruel episodes from the past, as well as thoughts on how the past have shaped who you are today. And that leads me to the most brave and most generous act of all, which is sharing your vulnerability. With a public exhibition, you don't know, you can't know who will see you, who will read your words, who will form opinions and ideas based on what they see. But what we, the people who work here, have seen in the short period of time that this exhibition has been on view is that it's very affecting to the people who come into the gallery. Family members of the participants come and take out their phones and take their images next to their loved ones and the people who are in the portraits. At opening night, people went around the gallery gathering autographs of everyone in the catalog. And I saw people coming up to Leonard Edlow asking him to autograph his Style Weekly cover. High school and college students who come have a specific name and face of someone who lived through this locally, a historical experience that happened not actually that long ago. There are museum visitors who have had their eyes opened by these stories, visitors who recognize themselves in your stories, and visitors who have experienced even worse and more recent acts of racism and prejudice, maybe in their community, maybe on this campus, maybe on the way to this panel discussion today. So to you participants, thank you so much for sharing, for all the sharing that you've done in the past, that you do for us now, that you no doubt continue to do in your communities, in your families, with your friends. We hope the project Growing Up in Civil Rights Richmond continues to be something that you are proud of and becomes, maybe for some of you, the beginning of a continuation of a relationship with us. Near the end of the Martin Luther King Day events this past Monday, I was teasing Reverend Josine Osborne, who's one of our participants, about how she had come early in the day for the Family Day activities. She ended up kind of hanging out with us all afternoon. She met friends in the gallery, and she was also there when other people came into the gallery, not expecting to actually meet one of the participants. So that was really exciting for these museum visitors. She attended the commemoration event. She enjoyed the reception afterwards. She met with old friends and new friends at that. And when I was heading out in the parking lot, she was closing it up. And and I said to her, "I hear you're coming back tomorrow." And she said yes. She came back to help with one of Laura's classes. So at one point during, towards the end of the day in the gallery, she said to me, "I'm getting addicted to you people." And I really can't think of a better compliment coming from Reverend Osborne than something like that. So it meant a lot to me. So thanks to you, and thanks to all of you for participating and for sharing and for coming today. So I'm going to wrap this up and segue over to the panel by introducing our moderator, Laura Browder. Laura is the Tyler and Alice Haynes Professor in American Studies at the University of Richmond. She is the author of numerous books, including When Janie Comes Marching Home, Portraits of Women Combat Veterans, her best shot, Women and Guns in America, and Rousing the Nation, Radical Culture in Depression America, which was named a Choice Outstanding Academic Book. She is the writer and executive producer of the 2012 PBS documentary, The Impersonators and American Identities. For the past 9 years, she and fellow University of Richmond theater professor Patricia Herrera, along with their students, have been producing documentary dramas and museum exhibitions about Richmond's civil rights history, as well as developing the digital archive, The Fight for Knowledge, Civil Rights and Education in Richmond. She is currently working on a biography of her grandfather, American Communist Party leader Earl Browder. So please join me in welcoming Laura to take over the panel. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, and it is so exciting to see such a big crowd here today, and a group which I think includes a lot of people who not only care deeply about Richmond's civil rights history, but who have lived through it and continue to live through it. And we've got great panelists today, and I will tell you all about them, but I will also tell you that our vision for today is not that the five of us will sit here and talk to one another, but that after I ask each panelist one question and that person answers, that we will then turn the conversation over to you, because I cannot imagine the kind of collective wisdom that there is in this room right now, and we want to take full advantage of that. So we've got a great group of panelists, and as I was thinking about my remarks today, I realized that probably every single person in this room is familiar with the work of at least one of our panelists, because together they are so deeply embedded involved in Richmond and Richmond's civil rights. So, as you know, Michael Paul Williams has been at the Richmond Times-Dispatch as a journalist since 1982, and since 1992, he has been writing a twice-weekly column which focuses a lot on civil rights. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including a Nieman Fellowship at Harvard University between 1999 and 2000, and that's an honor that only is awarded to a dozen journalists across the US, so it's a big deal. And Mike, I have to say to you that when I first moved here to Richmond in 1994, coming from New England, where I'd grown up and lived all of my life, I was traumatized every time I drove down Monument Avenue, which my dad still refers to as Trader's Row. The thing that made me feel better about my new home was reading your column. And
Thank you.
it made a huge difference. So, yes. To my immediate right, we have Elvatrice Belsches, who is a public historian, curator, archivist, researcher, lecturer, author. Did I leave anything out? You wear a lot of hats, Elva. And I think many of you are familiar with Elva's work, either her volume, Black America, Richmond, Virginia, or perhaps you've seen her wonderful 2017-2018 exhibition at the Black History Museum, which featured an amazing collection of 19th century photographs. And now I have to look at my notes to get the correct title. Yes, yesterday's stories, today's inspirations. Perhaps you've taken a guided tour sponsored by the National Park Service, which asked Elva to create and narrate a podcast about Jackson Ward, the Jackson Ward Historical District in 2010. And if you haven't met Elva yet, she is someone who you should get to know. Brian Palmer started his career extremely internationally and has come to do a deep dive into Richmond, and we are all so grateful for that. Brian is an acclaimed photojournalist and lecturer, and he has worked everywhere from being the Beijing bureau chief for US News and World Report to writing for the New York Times, The Nation, HuffPost, BuzzFeed, and many, many other publications. He was embedded 3 times with Marines in Iraq and created a documentary, an acclaimed documentary called Full Disclosure, which was funded by the Ford Foundation. But the reason that most of us know Brian today is because he and his wife, Erin Holloway Palmer, have since 2014 really dedicated their lives to the restoration and documentation of East End Cemetery. And most recently, they published a book together called The Afterlife of Jim Crow. And again, I'm looking at my notes to get what, yes, East End and Evergreen Cemeteries in photographs. So we are very, very fortunate to have both Palmers in town as well as in the house, because together they have done a tremendous amount to uncover the sometimes hidden histories of people who have lived and died and come to rest in Richmond. And it was such a pleasure to work with Brian on this project. Ashley Kistler has had an amazing career for the past 35 years as a curator and author in Richmond. Many of you know her from her work as the director of the Anderson Gallery at VCU, where she was also an associate professor in the School of the Arts. You might also have read her many gallery publications, exhibition catalogs, or her books, which most recently included Nancy Bloom, and again, I'm referring to what comes after the colon, Drawing, Sculpture, and Public Works. She has been an associate curator of modern and contemporary art at the VMFA, and most fortunately for me, Ashley was the curator and sucked me into the first exhibition I ever worked on, which was When Janie Comes Marching Home, focused on the experiences of women combat veterans, and Ashley really dragged me from the world of print into the world of images and of creating dialogic exhibitions, and for that I will be forever grateful. So I've prepared one question for each panelist today, and all of them are geared towards contextualizing the exhibition that we hope that you will all be visiting after the panel is over, because at 3:30, when we're done in here, we invite you to come and see the amazing faces and hear the incredible stories of the 30 participants who made Growing Up in Civil Rights exhibition what it is. And there will also be a reception with some delicious food and drink, so please do stick around. But all of that having been said, let me start on my questions. So Elva, let's start with you. And your question is, you've done a great deal of research and writing on the earlier history of Richmond. And can you connect that earlier history with the history that the subjects of this exhibition lived through?
Yes, glad you asked. When I was first tasked with this, I had to, first of all, I prayed, and then I gave it some thought, and then the case studies and examples really started to flow. We think of civil rights invariably as the 50s and the 60s, but there are myriad examples of agency and attempts to eradicate or ameliorate disparities in the late 1700s and 1800s in Richmond. So since I have 5 minutes, I do want to throw out 3 major areas I like to cover a little later. There was a profound sense of collectivism, faith-based collectivism, organizationally based collectivism, and something I call generational grooming. So within those 3 topics, I can connect the late 1700s and 1800s to what we think of as the civil rights movement. But in starting with one interesting story that stands out that relates to the late 1700s or 1800s is that in Richmond we had a city tooth puller by the name of Peter Hawkins. And Samuel Mordecai writes about him in his 1854 Richmond in Bygone Days. He talked about him being a raw-boned fellow who rode around the city on a raw-boned horse. I don't think that was a positive description. But nevertheless, Mr. Hawkins was legendary. He would take out his pullakins and pull out a tooth, and because he was so strong, sometimes the sound of good tooth would come out with the bad tooth. Now, I tell you, I start out with Peter Hawkins, not because of the fact that he was the city's tooth puller, but what captivated me, audience, was looking at his will. He died in the early 1800s. In his will, he allocated money for the education of his kids. So literacy, as we will see, undergirds all of that road to the civil rights movement. And literacy was important even in the late 1700s to blacks here. And so I will look at that literacy as it relates to, again, faith-based collectivism. So we'll hopefully get to talk about how the church educated folks, organizationally based collectivism, and something that I call generational grooming. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Elva. So Mike, you have covered civil rights issues in Richmond for decades now. How do you see the stories you read here and the portraits you see in that context? And what was it like for you to see your own experience contextualized this way?
Well, to tackle the last one, to dovetail on what Elizabeth said, looking at Brian's photo juxtaposed to my words, I felt like my words weren't worthy. So that was my first impression, like, whoa, what a photo. I wish I had said something more eloquent to match the photo. But they say that we as journalists write the first draft of history. It's the first draft because it's usually very incomplete. Newspapers throughout the country, and the one I work for is no different, often kind of dropped the ball when it came to writing that first draft where the civil rights movement was concerned and the stories that are told in this exhibit are concerned. So just looking at the stories, and they were just fascinating to me. And I thought, well, this is just kind of adding flesh and blood and heart to the bones, the skeleton of the stories that were told back in the day, as far as these movements. And it just struck me how I could relate to so many of them, even though the stories were diverse and we're of different ages and different experiences. One thing I picked up on in the stories was that the pain of change didn't discriminate. We talk of busing, and it's usually viewed as historically, especially back then, as something that was being done to the white community. Well, the black community wasn't having a great time at it either. As a child, I was watching this take place, and I wasn't really processing it, but I was. I lived in the West End earliest, in Byrd Park, and one of the kids went off to TJ for high school, and another went off to John Marshall, and it was a big deal. I was younger, and it was a big deal, and I didn't quite understand why. Maggie Walker was our school, but they were, this trickling was happening, and I didn't quite get it, but I kind of did get that it was a big deal. When I looked at the stories or I read the stories about people who felt like having an ally was important, or not going into a situation alone was important, or was important not to be alone. I'm thinking of, I believe, Daisy Weaver's account of how when she was at Duke, she was comforted by the fact that she had some people of color in her dorm. And it took me back to my childhood here in Richmond in, I think, 1963, when I was about to go off. I'd been going to West End Elementary, which was an all-black public school, and I'm Catholic, and in the first grade, my parents decided to enroll me in St. Benedict, in Cathedral, which was overwhelmingly white. And I remember my parents met with another set of parents and brought this kid over named Keith Dunn. And Keith and I were introduced to each other, and then the parents went off to talk, and they were very serious and in grave tones. And I'm 6 years old, and I picked this up. Okay, Keith is my ally. We're supposed to look out for each other. 6 years old, and it just was almost intuitive. We're going into a situation. So just just looking at the pictures, the recurring, everyone seemed to be photographed in a school setting or often a church setting. And to me, that was telling. Those were our pillars. The faith in our church, that was sustaining, and education was our way out, our source of uplift. And it just didn't seem coincidental. I'm the outlier, of course. I'm in front of Maggie Walker's statue, but that, I'd be a historian if I wasn't a journalist, so that just meant so much to me. Just seeing that statue go up, along with the civil rights statue down at the Capitol, was just amazing for me. So, it was just the perfect kind of marriage of I think, words and pictures. Seeing Reggie Gordon and Bobby Gray. Those are powerful images. These are men who are pictured looking extremely comfortable in basically the corridors of power. Bobby's in his law firm building. It looks like Riverfront Towers, and Reggie's in City Hall, and they're on top of the city. You can see that these are the vistas where they're like looking down on the city itself. And it's kind of a powerful image to me of how far we've come and how comfortable they look in having attained those perches. So I'm sure I'm way past my time limit, but there's just so much. I see Paige at the slave trail. And it's such a painful thing, but she looks, there's almost a tranquility there. She looks like, okay, I've come to terms with this history, but and now I'm trying to bring it together. Paige, to me, has kind of always embodied this someone who's like a firebrand, but also a bridge builder, which is kind of a curious thing to be, being both of those. So there was just so much. It felt like it was kind of distilling like 25 years of the stuff I've written about in a very powerful way.
Thank you. So Brian, you're up next. So you are very well known for the work that you and your wife, Erin Holloway Palmer, have done for 4 years now, right? Is it 4? It's almost 5. Because you started in 2014,
December
right?
2014, yeah.
Reclaiming and documenting the history of East End Cemetery. So how does that work intersect for you with the work that you've done on these amazing portraits in the gallery?
Well, first thing is, it's been Erin, me, and a whole group of dedicated volunteers who have done this work both at East End and Evergreen. We have some of them here, Mark and Karen Schmieder, and it's been a great group of people. And we've also had about 8,000 volunteer visits. So that's the community of Richmond, reclaiming Richmond. Intersections, it's a good word to use. I think for me, sitting here on the stage with people who are now friends, who are colleagues, who are inspirations, this is a pretty amazing intersection. And then looking out at you and seeing the people I photographed, it's a wonderful intersection, seeing the people that I've met through making these portraits and the stories that I've learned from reading Laura's interviews. This has been about, maybe cliche, but it's been about intersection. So how does the East End work connect to the civil rights work? There's a conceptual, there's this, as Mike was talking about, there's this tragic thread, discrimination, Jim Crow, segregation, desegregation. That's evident in the landscape at East End Cemetery, founded in 1897 by prominent members of the African American community, same as Evergreen, and starved by Jim Crow. And yet, when you look closely at that place, you see past the tragedy. You look at the inscriptions. You look at the care that people took. You look at the names. You look at the churches inscribed on these grave markers. Even the little temporary ones for people who couldn't afford to have real gravestones. I mean, Baby Boy Winston is one that sticks in my mind. So that's the intersection of tragedy and love. The tremendous love if you take the time to look. That's what strikes me, and it took me a while to see that because I was pulled back. I was seeing the whole cemetery the first time we went, and I saw just a little bit of shame, a little bit of tragedy. And what I hope Ashley and Laura saw in my work was how that developed once I started to see the care, the love, the power of the community, once I started to look very closely. So I think I had all of those lessons in me from confronting East End Cemetery as an intellectual exercise, as a tragedy, as an assignment to a place where I could discover what it meant to be African American in a particular time in our history, what it meant to be a Richmonder, and a whole new narrative. I mean, it was a different narrative than the one that we are accustomed to hearing in other sources. There's the white narrative, there's the black narrative. And to be immersed in that, and to be immersed in the process of rediscovering it with these folks, that's how this connects to me. So in terms of methodology, bringing the creative exercises, the creative lessons I learned from photographing mostly the cemetery itself, then the people doing the restoration work, UR, VCU, VSU, VUU, various churches, temples, synagogues, wounded warriors, and trying to express what you can't necessarily see in that landscape. I know that may sound lyrical and something else, but the idea being that I had to spend a lot of time there, I had to look. I had to truly look. And I think that when I approached the individuals to photograph, it was the same thing. I knew the stories, I didn't want to do something literal, but I did want to show people in their strength, and as they wanted to present themselves. Because I wanted us, all of us, to look these people in the eye and say, this is Richmond, these are contributors to our community, and we're assembling these stories so that we can learn more about our own city and our own history. So, intersections, zoom, zoom.
Absolutely. Good, good. So Ashley, finally to you. You've curated an incredible range of exhibitions during your 35 years of working as a curator in Richmond. How do you see this exhibition in the context of your work?
Hi, everyone. I didn't want to ramble, so I'm going to refer to these notes. Some years ago, I attended a talk by the New York City Cultural Affairs Commissioner Tom Finkelpearl when he was still director of the Queens Museum and on the verge of reopening the museum after a major overhaul. And he spoke about what I understood as a progressive and necessary shift in institutional focus from programs for the community to programs about the community to programs with the community. And of course, it is this third initiative, programs with the community, that engendered Growing Up in Civil Rights Richmond. As such, the development of the project, as you've already heard, was contingent on the input of 32 other people besides myself, the first-person perspectives of the project participants, and the expertise and artistry of Brian and Laura. Within this complex network of interactions, I was primarily a facilitator. And I think increasingly contemporary art curators are describing their role in this way, recognizing the benefits to be gained from a collaborative process. Implicit in this role of facilitation for me has been providing artists with opportunities to create new work, and that was certainly an essential component of this project. And while it enabled Brian to broaden his involvement in a community to which he and Erin are deeply committed, it also challenged him to think about making photographs through a process quite different from his usual practice as a photojournalist. And what a success. Just as there are countless incremental decisions that go into making a successful portrait, there are many small and not so small decisions that must coalesce to create an effective exhibition. Decisions in this instance related to the production and framing of the prints of the portraits, the editing and formatting of the text panels, the layout and installation of the work, and the content and composition of the catalog. And considering all these factors, I was intent on presenting this material in a way that not only, and most importantly, upheld the expectations of my collaborators, but also produced an experience as immersive as possible for each visitor who walks into those galleries. Now, of course, one hopes for that sort of outcome with each and every exhibition, but here, to do justice to the content of the show, I felt achieving this end result was especially crucial. And as someone who's been primarily focused on the image in its many forms and dimensions, I found once again that balancing the visual weight of the portraits and the text was a little tricky. And I just also must mention that Richard Waller, the director of the museum, and Elizabeth, who you've already met, were of course integral to all of these decisions. Unlike the didactic text panels you usually encounter in art museums, these panels, of course, serve a very different purpose, as the voices they relay are the very heart and soul of the exhibition. So, a wonderful dynamic occurs as Brian's vibrant portraits pull you into the space, as the story accompanying each engrosses you further, and as a shifting of your attention between the two confirms that neither really exists in its full dimension without the other. So I think this was a major goal of the installation. The compilation of these first-person narratives represents a means of producing an exhibition that mirrors the multivalent ways in which we should try to comprehend anything of significance. We've seen where a monolithic narrative of history takes us. This project advocates instead, as you've already heard, for a process that foregrounds personal stories in order to construct a fuller, more faithful picture of the past and how it impacts us today. So now it's my turn to ask a question. And coming back to Laura, this idea of storytelling in the form of oral histories has been such a vital resource for you in your research and scholarship. Can you talk a little bit more about how all of those things interact?
Well, I think there is something incredibly powerful, as you've said, in the personal narrative and in the way each one of us frames not only our own lives, but our own lives in the context of our community and the wider world. But I think even more than that, there is power in the dialogue among many. And, this project really had its genesis way, way back in, I want to say 2012. Could that be 2011 and 12, when Patricia Herrera and I had taught our first class about civil rights and education in Richmond, for which our students staged a documentary drama about massive resistance. And we had a discussion panel afterwards, and Mark Person, who's sitting here in the audience, was one of the panelists. And at the reception, as we were, huddling over the carrot sticks and grapes and cheese cubes, Mark said to us, you should really think about spending next year creating a play with high school during the busing era. And that was a great idea, and we did that. But then came a day that was even more powerful, when I got a call in the afternoon briefly, or a message from some journalist at the Times-Dispatch. I didn't have time to return it. I didn't know anything about it. And then the next morning I opened my newspaper and I saw a little piece about how that day we would be having a conversation in our classroom among people who had experienced with during the busing era. We had asked Mark if he had 2, 3, maybe 5 friends who he could bring to class to talk with our students. But when we saw this invitation in the Times-Dispatch, we knew that it was going to be a very different kind of animal. And in fact, well over 20 with alums, about half of them black and half of them white, sat in a circle in our classroom and talked about their experience in the early 70s. And there was a lot of laughter. There were also a lot of tears. People sang songs together. They brought up incidents that they had all experienced, but in very, very different ways. And by the end of the hour, it was really clear that even though our individual stories are powerful, even more powerful are our stories in dialogue with one another. So that if you go to the exhibition, you will see people talking about a lot of the same events, but often from very, very different perspectives. And it was that experience, I have to say, that really transformed me from someone who, yes, enjoyed living in Richmond, but was it really my city, to feeling deeply connected to the history of Richmond, a lot of which is virtually invisible unless you know the participants. And I think, something that we all really wanted to do with this exhibition is to bring what is hidden into the light. Because these are stories that are told within communities, but it is no surprise that, of course, to this day, there are parallel universes within the city. And stories that are told in the Black community when people experienced busing and other things during the civil rights era, versus in the white community, those stories are often narrated very differently, sometimes if at all. And so I think that is really the power of storytelling, to be able to open up new conversations, right? To allow people to participate in conversations maybe that they've never had before, that they've had from one angle but not another, and also just to see how complex and rich a tapestry civil rights history of Richmond is. And having said that, I'm going to try and neatly segue into the next part of our program when we ask you to all become part of that tapestry. We're going to have 2 students, each of them will have a mic, and they'll be coming up and down these halls. So what we'd love to do is to have you raise your hand, and when you raise your hand, one of these quick-witted students is going to see you and bring a mic over to you so that you can ask a question. And the lights are going up, which means we can all see one another. It's an opportunity for Brian to begin photographing you. And it's also a chance for us to open up the wider conversation. So, who wants to start off? I know someone's got a question. No questions from anyone?
Don't make us do. Ask them a question. That would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
I'd like to know if
We need a mic.
you raise your hand, I can talk. Thank you. I'd like to follow up on what the gentleman behind me just asked about. I'd like to hear from the participants in the group how the experience affected them in terms of a catharsis. I know that once you tell your story and you are able to share experiences, it sometimes makes you feel a little bit different about the experiences, and I'd like maybe for somebody to be able to comment on that.
Participants, can one of you raise a hand and call for a mic?
We have 2 right there. Right behind you. You have.
Josine.
Okay.
Maybe standing up will make it easier to.
Yeah.
Yes. Who's going to stand?
Oh,
yes.
Reverend Osborne. I didn't-
Wonderful.
I'm trying to get over a cold, but I thank you for that question. Would you give it to me a little bit more so I can really answer it fully? The person who asked the question.
We should just get them up here.
I use the term catharsis, in that I meant, did it make you feel a little freer of the experiences, the uncomfortable experiences, the bad experiences, maybe the burden of carrying your story around inside?
Well,
Did it make you feel a little bit relieved from that?
I'm going to tell you, truly, it lifted a burden. About 2 years ago, and I was listening at the time, about 2 years ago, when I began to see things in Richmond repeating itself to the Old South, and realizing the history that my parents had on both sides, and the investment of the community, it began to sadden me. It began to sadden me because the generation that I grew up in may not have had the material wealth, but they had a beautiful community that embraced them. And I don't see that anymore, collectively. I'm not saying that people don't have a good heart to want to be right, but I'm just saying that the whole system that we live under and that we operate isn't conducive, or the things that I see isn't conducive to really achieving the goals that Richmond could be. I enjoyed growing up in Richmond. I had 2 strong parents and family. I listened to her talk about the literacy. My grandfather was from the Braxton plantation. His name was Charles Braxton. And he could not read nor write, but he was very alert as far as knowing what time of day it was. And we always, like some people talk about the stock market, he was always talking about what was going on all around. He worked in Henrico, East Henrico, and farmers or whatever would always talk about things that was going on. And he kept his head to ear to what was going on. And he had a lot of vision. They used to call them seers, spiritual seers, if you know anything about that. And so I grew up in that tradition on my mother's side. On my father's side, all the way from Appomattox. He told us about the rural part of Virginia. And he didn't want us to grow up with a lot of baggage. He said it's important for you to know what type of people you're dealing with out here. When it gets cold and your crop didn't come in, who cares about the color of the skin? So he taught us very early about it was important, bottom line, to be able to be educated. My mother was the baby, and it was important for her to be able to raise up children that would be able to stand up and speak for her and her generation. And the community embraced each other. It was no competition. So what I see now is this is an opportunity. And I'm glad to hear various persons on the panel because I understand the process now. And it's an ingenious process. I enjoyed Ashley bringing it all together because you have to reach people at their gut level. You have to reach the humanity in people. And if you reach the humanity in people, people will do the right thing. And so when the walls of academia really meet the community, and that's what I heard, meeting the community, then I think we're on our way. And the burdens that I was referring to, it makes me feel a little bit better about where we had it now. Thank you.
Thank you. Reverend Mines, did you have your hand up?
Yes. There's
Yeah.
two in the back first.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Will, and I am a current sophomore here at the university. I'm from North Louisiana, so my question is more related to the changes that have come or are coming to Richmond. So I guess to put that in more of a question form for the panelists, I'm interested in understanding how Richmond has progressed or how it hasn't progressed in terms of racial discrimination, racial injustices, and things such as civil rights and segregation and desegregation and things of that sort.
That sounds like another good question for participants. Mike, you want to hit that?
How Richmond has progressed and hasn't progressed?
Is that in 2 minutes?
I feel like the more things change, we've made some individual progress. We have positions we never would have dreamed of having, but the community at large, the divides seem as large as ever in many ways, economically, even sometimes socially. I think we kind of inhabit two different worlds. And Richmond as a city has made a lot of progress superficially, and we're growing, and we have great restaurants and so forth and so on, but people are being left behind. And even as the city grows, that has the effect of displacing people and leaving people behind. So we still have a lot. I mean, the mayor's slogan is what, One Richmond? We're still far from One Richmond, and that was the situation in my childhood, and that's the situation today.
Absolutely, thank you. Another question. We had one more in the back here. Yeah, first.
I got the last question. How's everyone doing today? Okay, my question's pertaining to the civil rights movement. Before we were brought to America, the black Asiatic man, woman of America, well, that's in America, we were ruling nations that we owned. When we were brought here, we were stripped of that. During civil rights, with Martin Luther King being one of the predominant leaders, Malcolm X, Nation of Islam, etc., this started a mass growing movement, yes. People were enraged what was going on. People were causing havoc around the cities. People were coming together as one like a force, coming together to annihilate what was being thrown at them. And because they were doing this, rising up for themselves, agencies would put into play certain drugs, and they would have scientists specifically boost these drugs to boost testosterone, estrogen, in the black man, woman's bodies, specifically to demasculinize, to de-testosteronize the movement, in which Martin Luther King was also assassinated and killed in the hospital. So my question is, who are the people today and back then, and the agencies today and back then that are fighting against things of this nature that the CIA, government are doing to help deteriorize our nation?
I think we photographed the people who are doing that work at the grassroots, and there are a lot of those people are in this room. I mean, it doesn't just have to be the national leaders or the people we know. I mean, we should be, if you're talking about civil rights, we should be talking about Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer and Septima Clark and Bayard Rustin. Those were, and the foot soldiers and everybody else. So they're in this room, and we know of them. So I think we need to know of them and speak their names and read their work. And that will be, my wife hates it when I use this word, but that'll be our sustenance. And that will be what connects us. Mm-hmm. What Elva was saying. Elva is bringing that history from the 18th century to us. Peter Hawkins, that's a name I didn't know. All we need to do is, we got to fight, but we got to listen first.
To listen, because, one of the things that was so striking when I did interviews with all 30 people in the exhibition was how people in the exhibition, even though they were talking about events that happened to them many decades ago, they are still fighting. They are still idealistic. They are still engaged in the struggle. And that, to me, was one of the most inspiring things about the process. Elva.
Yes, I want to thank you for sharing your story on your grandfather, Mr. Braxton. Going back a little bit, the black church, let's talk about the 1800s, was the center of the black universe. So you will see literacy attained there. For an example, as early as 1815 at the First Baptist Church, you had the Crane brothers, who were white, teaching blacks 3 days a week, reading and writing. Yes, Lot Carey was getting ready to go off to Liberia, but once you learned to read and write, the rest of them could figure out how to read the newspaper too. And so you had sort of a each one teach one even over 200 years ago. Having said that, along the lines of the church, again, the church actually provided people with organizational skills. They learned Robert rules of order in their secret organizations. As early as 204 years ago, we had an organization called the Burying Ground Society of the Free People of Color of Richmond, Virginia. And I have been blessed to see some of their extant records from 1845. They were clearly fluent in Robert's rule of order, but it was important for them to be buried respectfully, you see. As we come into insurrections, you will start to see, or you can see, that the laws became more and more restrictive as it relates to learning how to read and write. One quick story I like to share is this. You know, we hear a lot about the slave trade here, but hardly anybody lectures about the free black experience. I do. Having said that, what city do you think had the highest number of free blacks, let's say in 1860? I'm an educator, so I throw out questions all the time. Any guesses? No, in Virginia. I'm sorry, in Virginia, what city do you think had the highest number of free blacks? What's Petersburg, that's right. They had about 3,200, but Richmond was second with 2,600. And out of that group, I wanted to pull out the Ruffin family. George Washington Ruffin was born free in around 1800, and his wife was born free too. You know, you were what your mom was. Having said that, they had about 8 kids or so, and their father was a barber. Barbers did very well, black barbers did. Having said that, I know through extant receipts from that family that they hired black and white tutors to teach their kids. That goes back to the importance of literacy that they saw even during the antebellum period. Some of the slave people did the same thing. But the Ruffin family made the ultimate sacrifice in around 1853. They sent Nancy Ruffin, who was the mom, and the kids off to Boston so that they could attain a secondary education. And what came out of that was nothing more than legendary. The oldest son, George Lewis Ruffin, read the law. You know, you can still read the law, but he read the law. And then he entered Harvard University's law school, and he became the first known black graduate of Harvard's law school in 1869. So Richmond can boast of that. But it's that literacy that they believed in and that ultimate sacrifice and sending mom and the kids up there. And as another aside, we have another Ivy League graduate we can boast about from Richmond. Edwin Archer Randolph went up to Yale University, graduated in around 1880, becoming the first black graduate of Yale's law school. We didn't get this stuff in school when I was coming up in Richmond, so it's important to tell stories of interracial cooperation because there are myriad examples out there here, even during that time. But the role of literacy can be encapsulated with many examples like that. And before I yield back my time again, I want to mention the role of the black church again. If it's not apparent already, take a look at what happened after freedom came with the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen's Bureau schools. The first Freedmen's Bureau schools audience were in the black churches here. First African, which was founded in 1841. Second Baptist, which was founded in 1846. Third African, which became Ebenezer, 1857, 1858. St. Philip's, 1861. So you had about 5 or 6 churches that were founded prior to the beginning, really, of the Civil War. Each of them had a Freedmen's Bureau school. And one of the most powerful, and one of the schools that came out of that was Richmond Colored Normal and High, that became Armstrong High School. So few schools in America can boast of a school that is still in existence that started under the auspices of the Freedmen's Bureau. It was organized in October of 1867. Look at the number of civil rights heroes that come out of Armstrong. We look at people like Dr. William Ferguson Reed, just myriad people. John Mitchell, Maggie Walker, they were Richmond Colored Normal graduates. And so you can see that dynamic as it relates to the church, as well as those early Freedmen's Bureau schools. Let me share with you one powerful image that I love to share as it relates to this. Many of you know, a lot of, they were called Yankee school moms came down to initially teach in the Freedmen's Bureau schools, although we had black teachers also here teaching in the Freedmen's Bureau schools. But the Chase sisters came up from Norfolk to Richmond in April, right after the end of the war. Lucy Chase and her sister Sarah. And the picture they paint, audience, is regarding their arrival is they came to start the schools at First African, and they were met by over 1,000 people ready to learn how to read and write. That's a powerful image. Those things that have been systematically denied, and people were waiting, from the little ones to those who had snow-capped hair. It is an amazing story. I have a whole presentation, Tell Them We Are Rising, a survey of the African American educational experience, but it is intertwined with the church. We still will go back to the church. And so there is a connection. When we think about that church, and also let's cut to 1904 with the boycott. Yeah, thank you, the streetcar boycott. Where did they hold a mass meeting? At 3rd Street, Bethel. Okay, so it's, we can always come back to the church. And one more major story, in case I don't get to speak anymore. I love what I do, I'm sorry. But at the end of the war, people thought all would be well after the fall of Richmond. But what blacks found is that they were brutalized, brutalized in every way you can imagine. And so to try to get some type of redress, because they didn't get it from the Freedmen's Bureau folks, they had a mass meeting where about 3,000 people packed into First African, and they elected about 5 or 6 men to represent, what they were going through. These men, including Thomas Chester, who was a reporter for a Pennsylvania newspaper, actually traveled up and met with President Andrew Johnson, and things changed as a result of that. So you can see that agency even in the 1800s, you see. And I have myriad examples, but I'm going to yield back my time again. Thank you.
Yes, I was just wondering if there are any participants of the Richmond 34 here this evening, if they'd stand up and be recognized.
The Richmond
34? No.
Richmond 34?
I think there were a number of participants who worked with the Richmond 34 and got their training at Virginia Union. I see Loretta Tillman in the audience, and I would love to hear some of her stories. Josine Osborne, I know, has a lot of experience working in that area. Is there anyone else here who was active in the early 1960s in the boycott and march movement? Who wants to talk? Wonderful.
Mrs. Winston.
Yay.
Do you want to say anything?
Yes, my name is Nell Draper Winston. I hadn't planned to talk, but when she asked if we were a part of the boycott, that's where I was going to stand. But we were the second tier of the 34, Richmond 34, who boycotted Richmond, Tallheimer's department store. And Thursdays were the Minister's Day. And I was so happy and proud to see my pastor at that time, Reverend George Damascus Hill, who at that time was between 79 and 85, and he was out there in the rain one Thursday with his umbrella up, and he was just marching, in support of the boycott. But it was, there were some rough days, and we did have training there, I think 2 or 3 weeks, as to what we thought the police or spectators might do. We pushed each other down, we slapped each other, we did everything, and we came short of spitting on each other. We didn't do that, but that was one of the things that we felt might happen. But those of us who picketed with me, we were very fortunate that nothing like that happened. They did have the police dogs, and I recall there was a certain, Tallheimers and Miller Roads were together, right, joined together there, and we had to march just to the edge of Tallheimers. We couldn't go on what do you call that, the curbs as a, I wasn't prepared to speak, but anyway, as they ended in the next block, curve, we couldn't step on the other end that was close to Miller Roads, or we would be, or something would happen. That's the way they said it. And so I remember looking up with my placard in hand, and this policeman kind of nudged at the dog. And I remember when I was a child, he said, "Sick 'em, sick 'em." He didn't say that, but he nudged at it and then looked at me. And I just knew that was it, but the dog didn't move, so that wasn't the attack word. But I think he did that just for my benefit. And so needless to say, I didn't look at him anymore. And but it was that type of thing. It was very intimidating, and it was we were afraid, but we knew that we had to complete the job that we had started. Thank you.
I would like to thank the panel for their presentation and ask a question. I was an alternate delegate for a state senator here in Virginia, in this fair city, who was nominated as a standard bearer for the Democratic Party as governor, and his name, of course, was Douglas Wilder. And I'd ask the panel how you view and your perspective on Douglas Wilder's impact here in Richmond and across the state in terms of civil rights.
Who would like to take that question?
I'll take it. Elva. I think that's a lesser known legacy of Governor Wilder's. However, touching on that and talking about the Richmond 34 at the same time, I think is how I will bring this about. One of the Richmond 34 was 4T Johnson Jr. And he, a little bit later, he was stopped and his license wasn't what it should be. So as he stood in traffic court, he decided not to sit in the quote-unquote colored section. He was held in contempt, and got a record out of that. The case moved up, and Roland Duke Ely took that on, along with M. Ralph Page and Howard T. Benn. That case, everyone went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and it was because of that case that courtrooms across America were desegregated. So Johnson versus Virginia, and Mr. 4T Johnson went on, by the way, to Harvard University's law school and graduated too. He was a part of the Richmond 34, so was his sister Eleanor Johnson Rice. So out of that, why do I say that? It was Doug Wilder who got on the phone with 4T Johnson Sr., Dr. 4T Johnson, who was a noted dentist, to say, they just arrested your son. But having said that, because of that 1963 decision, everyone, you started to see a snowball effect. Later in 1963, and this is where I can pull Governor Wilder in, you had cases that would desegregate Parker Field. We were growing up, it was Parker Field, and that was the Diamond. Also, what we call the Altria today was the Mosque. Rupert Pikett, who was the longtime executive secretary of the Virginia Teachers Association, was instrumental. He led the charge, or he was the plaintiff in the Parker Field case. Dr. Felix Brown, I think, did the one on the mosque. But because the brilliant lawyer Martin A. Martin died, who was a partner of Oliver Hill's, it was Doug Wilder who was brought on to complete that case. So when it came to fruition, there's a wonderful picture of Governor Wilder, J. Rupert Pikett, and one more person whose name I think Lester Banks, Lester Banks is in the picture. But you can see the snowballing effect. We can bring in the Richmond 34, talk about 4T Johnson Jr., and talk about Governor Wilder all in the same breath. But that snowball effect from the sit-ins, and think about it, that's a precedent-setting case. That case dismantled desegregation in courtrooms across America. So there are powerful stories like this we need to get out to not only the young people, but the tweeners alike and the elders, because this is a special time. There is something very special coming up regarding the Richmond 34. It's not for me to talk about, but stay tuned. So did that answer the question? That's just one thing. Okay, all right.
And I thought there was another hand back there. Yes.
Good evening. Good evening.
Good evening.
I said I wasn't going to say anything, but anyone that knows me knows that's not possible. I'm Charles McLeod, and I'm here tonight really as an observer, as a note taker, quite frankly, because first of all, I'm not from Richmond. I hope that doesn't weigh too heavily against me. But I am a child and a product of the 60s. And what should be understood here clearly is that what was going on in Richmond was just a fraction and just representative of what was going on around the country, especially throughout the South. And so I just want to thank those of you who made the contributions of your personal lives to help to bring about the change that we see today. One of the things that makes it so difficult, challenging, if you will, is for people to really understand I have the full benefit of what you guys went through. Whether it was the 34 here, or the children in Farmville, or the ones in Petersburg or in Chesterfield where I was. It was a different time. It was a totally different time. And because we haven't been honest, not us necessarily those here in this audience, I know we're all honest people here, but because America hasn't been honest about the true period of time that we went through, it's difficult for people to really get a realistic sense of the sacrifices that were made. But I just want to tell you all, I want to say to you, thank you for your contributions, and keep telling your stories. History is important, not to the past, but to the present and for the future. And when I say history, I don't mean fake history. I mean real history, what really happened. I said I was going to keep quiet and just take notes, because actually I've been invited to present in a few weeks for Chesterfield County on the desegregation of schools in Chesterfield County, 1962. Don't let my youthful looks deceive you. But in any event, it's important to all of us to understand that this country has gone through a lot, and we have come a long ways. We've got a long ways to go. As someone spoke mentioned earlier, we may be further apart today than we ever were. And I won't call names, but we all know who some of the primary dividers are. Right. But we allowed ourselves to get that far away from one another because we've never really been truthful about the past. But in order for us to have a serious conversation about race, or to even approach racial conciliation, we really have to go through racial atonement. And that means having a stark, face-to-face vision and view of what we've gone through and what the past has been for all of us. So I encourage you guys to continue to do what you're doing.
Thank you.
Continue to have meetings and conversations and to speak openly and honestly, not past each other, not at each other, but to one another.
Thank you. Well, that's,
Thank you.
I think,
That's
one of the main purposes. When I was speaking to Reverend Osborne about what this show meant at this current political moment, and if I may reveal some of our conversation, you were saying that you were not terribly hopeful about our political environment until this show. And I think what this exhibition, what these essays, what is being said in this room brings out the truth that will lead us toward the reconciliation. You don't get the reconciliation without the truth, without these difficult stories, these intersections of these narratives. What strikes me is that we have rhetoric coming from various places in our nation's capital and elsewhere that wasn't around in 1948, but those of you who know George Wallace, I mean, that kind of narrative seems to be gaining hold once again. And I think that's a divide and conquer thing. And I think it's particularly pernicious. I think this is the backlash against the first African American president. We're moving farther away from evidence-based, reality-based, testimony-based discourse. This, in a sense, contributes to stopping that. We have to understand these stories. One person's story doesn't necessarily match another person's story, but they're grounded in personal experience and they're grounded in evidence. So this idea that we can have fake news and so on and so forth, irrelevant. Sad, irrelevant. What we have here, we have the raw material to defeat all of that pernicious, toxic nonsense, in my view.
Thank you. I'm Mark Person, and thank you all for contributing. A few years back, I get a telephone call, and nice lady, she said, "I'm Dr. Laura Browder," and I'd taken a class at University of Richmond. I said, "I hope the check cleared." And she said, "No, you're okay there." So, and she said, my class is we're doing a class and we're studying civil rights in Richmond and busing and education. And she said the class, one of the attendees, her daughter was in the class, Elizabeth, and she said, "You're in the book." And I said, "I didn't even know the book existed," but a professor from the University of Georgia had written a book on busing, and a few years earlier they had quoted me about my experiences going through public high schools. And she said, "I think your comment was you're the one who really had positive things to say about it." I said, "Well, I had a great time, and it was very challenging, but I grew up Westover Hills area, and I played sports, anything that bounced, we were out there, you know, and we played ball all around the city. The city would have a championship, and we played, you know, everybody that would take us on. We won more than we lost. We always say that anyway. But growing up, my brother and I, and he's I think here today, he drove from Northern Virginia. We had a lady that stayed with us, and anybody remember the station WANT? And I played the trumpet, started playing it in 4th grade, and she turned me on to WANT, and I said, "This is great." And she told me stories about the Walker, the Armstrong Classic, and I wish we'd stayed in touch with her better, but next thing I go to Westover has a 7th grade, And this is right when the buses in Washington, D.C., there's, there are riots, buses being flipped. And next thing, WITH had an 8th grade, so I go there. And then the busing takes place. It's, forced integration. And in the white flight movement, lost a lot of friends. They said, well, what do you know? So I can catch the bus now. I looked at it as an opportunity. So the demographics, so all of a sudden we're in different cultures. And so from the 9th through the 12th grade, it was challenging. And so when Dr. Browder contacted me, I said, well, yeah, I've got a lot of friends. And it kind of went on. So as we speak, the other night, a couple of us were at the Georgia with High School game. They asked me if I'd be help out with the Athletics Hall of Fame committee. I said, sure, why you ask me? They said, because you play ball with everybody in Richmond. Well, that's true. And look out there and the 2 officials I play ball with, but it was the real world. And then we have a alumni group, and we presented 2 scholarships to the kids this year. And Valerie and I were up at the school the other night, and they know about this project. So anyway, it was a very positive experience. And another note this ties into it, I left this morning. We have a church in Southampton County, Virginia. It dates back to 1838. And if you're familiar with the Nat Turner story, he was baptized on Person's Mill Pond. And we've had the Nat Turner Bible in family 100 years, and it's been donated to the Smithsonian. So it's all part of the story, though. And recently, the perspective, I've been in touch with the Turner family, and I said, your story is as important as everyone, so they came to the reunion. So anyway, it's time for reconciliation. So thank you.
I have to stand. I'm a preacher. I can't help it. Greetings, everyone.
Greetings.
I just want to say that I'm grateful for seeing all of your beautiful faces. And what you represent is hope. Okay? Because you came out, you're interested in what's going on and hearing people's stories and knowing about the past and not denying that it happened and trying to find solutions on how we can come together. And I just want to thank each of you, the panel, and all the students and volunteers who put this awesome program together, because coming up in Richmond, you didn't think anybody cared. Yeah, this happened to me, but they don't care. And it's so easy to go into a dark place. Okay? There are a lot of stories out here, a lot of survival stories. There are people in this audience who may have helped someone along the way that we don't even know about it. But my challenge to you, I don't know how many of you are believers, how many of you are followers of Christ, or what religion you may be in, but it's time for us to break down the walls and come together in missions and worship with people who do not look like us. Okay? It's time. It's past time. We have to be intentional. Okay? That's how it's going to happen. Loving one another and recognizing that our Creator wants us to come together. And we are much stronger than those who want us apart. Amen?
We have almost gotten to the end of our official program. We have time for one more question. One more question. And then our hope is that we will all congregate in the gallery and at the reception and continue this conversation in more informal ways. And I also want to throw out, in case I don't have time for this later, that this really is an ongoing conversation. That this exhibition represents the culmination of 7 years' work, yes, but we continue to want to record new conversations, to keep the dialogue going in a lot of different ways. And if you are interested in talking to me or to Patricia Herrera, because we teach together We have taught together every year for 9 years, sometimes every semester, more than that, when we can get away with it. And all of our work is concerned with gathering oral histories from the community and
Can
using...
I suggest one?
Yeah.
Dovetailing on what Mr. McCloyd said about Chesterfield. I experienced far more trauma in Henrico County than I did in the city. And a lot of these conversations tend to be urban-centric. Inner city has become kind of some sort of buzzword, but there are more people of color now living in the suburbs now, and for some time, than live in the city of Richmond.
It's true.
And I think we know a lot of, obviously, our roots as people, as black people in rural America, and we migrated to urban America, but then there's not much conversation about our suburban heritage.
That's really true.
I think that's a conversation worth having.
I think that's a conversation well worth having, because I remember very clearly a lot of conversations I've had and parts of stories, some of which made it into the exhibition and some of which didn't, which all had to do with racial trauma and racism in the suburbs and resistance to that racism. And you're absolutely right, this is something that does not get told a lot. I mean, until I interviewed Mac McLeod, I did not know, for instance, that the reason that we had Monaghan High School in the suburbs was because the white schools were called for Confederate heroes, and the African American schools were called after African American heroes. And so what do you do when you try to build an integrated school? You need a Native American name, right? And I think that's something that isn't well known. And there are many, many more stories like that. So we accept your challenge. Absolutely. But we do have time for one last question.
Hello.
Who is it going to be?
Hello.
Oh.
My name is Keith Fleming, and I was listening to the preacher lady down there.
Where are you?
And during the civil rights movement, we was fighting for equality under the law. My question when I was listening to her is, do you think now in 2019 that we have that? Also, how do we get to the point where if I do something, and as a black American, and Caucasian do something, that is equal treatment under the law for the punishment phase? Because I'm asking this question because I'm a product of injustice. And I want to know, how can it equal out? I'm not saying give anybody a pass on their crime, but you equal it out where everybody got to pay for whatever they do.
Thank you for that question. Is there a panelist or audience member, participant, who wants to respond? Loretta Tillman.
I would say this: if you don't fight for what you want, you will get nothing. And that's something that has gotten lost in all of this. I'm here to speak for the dead more than I am for my own experiences, because my mother has been dead for nearly 50 years and my father over 50 years. Grandparents born right after the Civil War. All of them involved in all of these fights. You know, I remember being a very small child, and my mother would leave every Monday to go where? To the meetings for, I believe it was the Richmond, whatever the Teachers Association was. And they were fighting, and I was a little girl. And I grew up with people fighting, because they knew if they did not fight, they were going to get nothing. And that's one of the things I think that has gotten terribly lost in all of this, be it unions, be it civil rights organizations, be it whatever. If you want, if you will lay down, somebody will walk over you. It's just that simple. So you either stop whining or you get up and fight. And that's what I was always taught. Unfortunately, we have gotten to a place now that we have come to believe that fight is a bad thing. But that anything that we have now that we consider to be sacred, from the 8-hour workday to, you know, to protections under the law to whatever, are they written? Do you see them written in the Constitution 200 and some years ago? Do you see them written in the law? No, because that wasn't where their focus was. If you don't fight, you will get nothing. And that's what I'm going, that's what my thing is to you. because my mother did it, my father. My father did not have a college education. That is a long story. But I found out from the census records, we thought for years that he didn't, because he was a manual labor. He worked 5 jobs, 5 manual jobs in the 60s. Come to find out he actually had been to college for 1 year. My mother, on the other hand, state of Virginia paid for her to go to Columbia to get a graduate degree so that she didn't wind up at UVA or William & Mary. A lot of that is not well known either. That good public money of your ancestors was used to do anything and everything to make sure that things were separate. But somebody got out and fought. And now her daughter got to go to UVA in 1978, where she could never have stepped in there back in the 1930s. Fight. Let somebody know. Be the protester. Get your signs out. Don't stop. Do what you got to do. And you know what? You'll probably find that a lot of people will say, maybe they're right. And they'll join you. And the next thing you know, the law has changed, or the way people think about the way things should be have changed, because that's even more important than just changing the law. And that's all.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Let us reconvene, go see the exhibition, have some snacks, and please just keep talking.
Snacks.
Yay for snacks.